with another book review. It is Shout, Sister, Shout. There are 10 girl singers who shaped a century, and their little biographies written by Roxane Orgill. So I'll read something from the introduction. First of all, on the cover page here, it's written dip into this collective biography of 10 outstanding female singers of popular music in the 20th century and meet some of the most remarkable women who ever lived. Through intimate personal details and numerous photographs, interviews, and tidbits of little known information, music critic Roxane Orgill brings to life 10 girl singers and the decades in which they did their best work. Readers of Shout, Sister, Shout will learn about the lives, the loves, and the music of these, of the 1900s. So, writing in a friendly, readable style, the author has created a book of great distinction that will fascinate and inspire readers of all ages. And in the introduction, she writes that the book concentrates on just 10 performers out of easily 100 candidates who qualified as great singers in the United States from the years 1900 through 1999. How to choose just 10? First of all, they had to be terrific singers whose voices I wanted to listen to over and over. That doesn't necessarily mean that they had great voices. The jazz singer Anita O'Day did not, of the 1950s, did not have much of a vocal instrument, certainly as compared to her better known contemporary, Sarah. But what Anita did with her little voice was more interesting to me than what Sarah did with her magnificent one. Each woman had to have an interesting story to tell. How did she become a singer? Did she take charge right away, or did others manage for her? What stood in her way, and how did she get round it or push it aside? In each of the 10 stories I tell here, a woman struggles to make the most of a musical gift. The singers represent 10 different genres of popular music and entertainment. Sophie Tucker was a red-hot mama in vaudeville. Bette Midler, a rock singer who found her niche in cabaret. Joan Baez sang folk songs, and Judy Garland starred in movie musicals. Every singer in this book made a significant contribution to her genre as well as to the culture in general. The book is organized by decade with one singer per decade. Each singer appears in the decade in which she did her best or most prolific work. Pairing a singer and a decade was a challenge for the 1990s, which was still rolling as I wrote. Suddenly, I was no longer dealing with history, but with the present. How was I to know which of the top performers would still be considered exceptional 10, 20, 30 years from now? The solution. Chapter 10 focuses on 3 facts of country music, with Lucinda Williams, a singer-songwriter on the fringe of mainstream country, as a central figure, and 2 hugely popular crooners, Wynoma Jude and Leanne Rims, in sidebars. Following these criteria meant leaving out many wonderful performers, including some of my and no doubt the reader's favorites. Rosemary Clooney, whose recordings I'd take to that imagined desert island where you're allowed only 1 or 2 treasured possessions, is not in the book. She was best known in the 1950s, but did her most acclaimed work in the 1980s and 1990s, and she did not, I feel, represent the events and national mood of those decades. Aretha Franklin is also not here because I felt her story was too thin, perhaps because she's a private person and has yet to reveal much of her past. A popular singing trio from the 1920s and 1930s. The Boswell sisters also didn't make the book, but Connie Boswell and her siblings, Wet and Martha, did record a song in 1931 whose title, Shout, Sister Shout, captured exactly the sentiment I had about the work of my chosen singers, and thus inspired the title of this book. The list goes on: Barbara Streisand, Doris Day, Mahalia Jackson, Peggy Lee, Whitney Houston, Ella Fitzgerald, Janis Joplin, Billie Holiday, Patsy Cline, and Linda Ronstadt, to name just a handful of great voices. I apologize for their absence, she writes. How do I know a great singer from a not so great singer? I come to this book from more than 20 years as a music critic for newspapers and magazines, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, etc. I began studying music as a child by playing the violin and continued my studies in college and graduate school, where I concentrated on music history and theory. Along the way, I found I loved writing about music. It's a challenge to attempt the impossible, that is, to put music into words. If I do the job well, a person might go out and listen to something new or hear an old favorite in a new way. My training was in classical music, and popular music is a relatively recent thrilling discovery for me. Pop music in all its diversity is one of this country's richest and most lasting contributions to the world. It's my hope that by book's end the reader has some sense of the music's progress across the century and the pleasures it offers. As Madonna sang, celebrate. Read the stories, then go find their recordings. Listen to these ladies sing. They have so much to tell us. R.O. August 2000. So here's Sophie Tucker of 1900s. Of the 1910s, this is Madame Gertrude Rainey. Of the 1920s, this is Bessie Smith. Of the 1930s, it is Ethel Merman. Of the 1940s, Judy Garland. 1950s, it is Anita O'Day. Of the 1960s, it's Joan Baez. The 1970s, it is Betty Midler. Of the 1980s, it's Madonna, the Material Girl. 1990s, it's Lucinda Williams. That's the ISBN number. That is, you can read for yourselves and see if you want to. It's a must read. You will enjoy reading it. So here it's written, there are so many incredible singers that this past century has produced, and unfortunately so many young kids today have never even heard of them. I hope Shout, Sister Shout will become a part of as many school libraries as possible across the country. It will hopefully not only educate but also inspire the next century's group of great singers and entertainers. So inside of the jacket, the last page, a little bit about the author. Roxane Orgill played the violin as a child and concentrated on music history and theory in college and graduate school. She has been a music critic for more than 20 years, writing for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and etc. And she lives with a husband and young daughter in Hoboken, New Jersey. I want to read a little from one of my favorites, John Baez. In 1964, John Baez decided not to pay the portion of her annual federal income taxes that went towards building weapons. She wrote a letter to the American government. Dear friends, what I have to say is this. I do not believe in war. I'm not going to volunteer the 60% of my year's income tax that goes to armaments, she wrote. There are two reasons for my action. One is enough. It is enough to say that no man has the right to take another man's life. My other reason is that modern war is impractical and stupid. We spend billions of dollars a year on weapons which scientists, politicians, military men, and even presidents all agree must never be used. Sincerely yours, John C. Baez. Uh, Although she was only 23 years old, John was already famous as a folk singer, and when she released the letter to the press, it was printed around the world. By sending representatives to her concerts to collect money from the cash register during performances. The government eventually got its tax money. But Joan didn't care. The point was what I was refusing to give it to them, and that they were spending a lot of time and money to come and collect it. And meanwhile, the tax resistance movement was growing. Blessed with a thrilling, clear soprano voice, Joan realized early on that she could do more than sing. She could use her fame as a singer to draw attention to causes that were important to her. Joan was absolutely right for her time. In the 1960s, was the age of protest, marches, and boycotts. So, out of the thousands of girls with guitars, it was Joan, a friend of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who got to sing "We Shall Overcome" at the famous March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom when she was 22. In New York City, she met Bob Dylan. He looked forlorn in a worn, too small leather jacket, and he sang his own songs in a crusty, creaky voice. Joan fell in love. Many years later, she wrote a hauntingly beautiful song called Diamonds and Rust that captured her feelings at the time. She called Dylan a legend, the unwashed phenomenon, the original vagabond who strayed into her arms. Joan joined Dr. King in the South in 1963, helping to register black children in all-white schools, and in Washington, D.C., marching for civil rights for black people. There, on an August afternoon, Dr. King abandoned his notes and launched into the now famous spontaneous speech, "I Have a Dream," and Joan led the marches in "We Shall Overcome." "My knees were knocking," she called. "I was so young, and it was such a big crowd, 250,000 people." She wrote, music alone isn't enough for me. She said, "I'm not on the side of a life in action as well as in music. Then all those sounds, however beautiful, are irrelevant to the only real question of this century. How do we stop men from murdering each other? And what am I doing with my life to help stop the murdering? Whatever I do now in music has to be part of that larger context. So here we have a picture of John Baez performing with Bob Dylan in 1964.